I'd like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. Improving the quality of life for our customers and their patients is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. It's likely a similar mission to many of you joining us today. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether it's through hosting these free panel sessions or webinars, or partnering with world-class medical device experts like today's presenter, Helene Cui, or through our award-winning cloud-based solutions. At Greenlight Guru, our focus is on moving medtech forward, which means helping you get your life-changing medical devices to market and keeping them there over time. We know the challenges that medical device companies face in this heavily regulated industry, and our solutions are designed to help streamline your processes so you can navigate regulatory hurdles and succeed in the market. Greenlight Guru's MedTech suite provides quality management, product development, and clinical data management solutions, along with high quality training and education designed exclusively for medical device professionals. See why 1,100 of the world's medtech companies trust Greenlight Guru by heading over to www.greenlight.guru after today's session and seeing a personalized demo. Okay, also, today's session is focused on clinical claims and how to collect the relevant clinical data to meet the authorities' expectations. Well, at Greenlight Guru, we have built the leading toolbox for medtech clinical data collection, specifically designed for medtech operations. Greenlight Guru Clinical is a single compliant platform for collection and management of all clinical evidence, safety, and performance data. So, now that we've talked about those things, let us also turn our attention to today's presenter, Helene Cui, CEO at QMed Consulting. Helene Cui has a degree in science specialized with cell biology from the University of Odense, Denmark. Helene has more than 25 years of experience within the pharma and medical device industries. Her primary expertise is within the clinical and regulatory areas, such as device development, quality management, project management, clinical trial execution, market access, and general management. In 2006, she founded QMed Consulting as a private consultancy company providing services within medical device development and clinical trials. All right, now for the part you've all been waiting for, the featured content of today's webinar. It's my pleasure to hand it over to our presenter. Take it away, Helene.
Thank you very much, Etienne, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this webinar. I've really been looking forward to it. This is one of my favorite topics, and based on the experience that I have from our work at QMed Consulting. So setting the stage for the rest of the presentation, why is this topic so important, talking about the safety and performance endpoints? Well, we see for most of the clients that we work with on their clinical evaluation and their clinical investigations, the protocol and also the reports, when we present these to the notified body, or if we identify it before and agree with the client, we do see that there are some common findings that I will highlight and come up with examples during this presentation on how to come around these findings. So the overall purpose is to demonstrate compliance and rely on presenting sufficient clinical evidence for the device and its variations under the assessment that you are presenting to the notified body. And some of these, when you present the evidence, we sometimes see that there is a lack of a detailed analysis of the data that you have available, and also that the way that you present them, so actually the tables and how you reference the data throughout the tables and the evidence, and all the way down to your references, are lacking the full overview. We have to remember that the notified bodies are specialists and people, even though they're very skilled, the better you can present your data and the more clear it is how it is connected, the better it is for them to understand. When we then go further down into the actually data that we present, so that is the state of the art, or the SOTA, and the safety and performance objectives and the clinical benefits, we sometimes see that there is no clear link between the conclusions that we draw upon the data that we actually have put a lot of efforts in presenting and down to the actually conclusion of the analysis. So that red thread, as we call it, within the team is sometimes missing. And then we see that there are inconsistencies across the documentation. So in the clinical evaluation plan, clinical evaluation report, instructions for use, and for example, the risk management file, there is not an alignment between the data that you have collected, again, from your state of the art and your own clinical investigations into these technical documents. There are also often a lack of use of the post-market surveillance data, so both vigilance from similar and your own products, if that's available. These are needs to be analyzed with the same stringency as you have with your own data and also the data found in the literature. And when we look into what is the actually plan then to collect then safety and performance data, it is not always described clearly how you have defined that as clinical endpoints in your clinical development plan. And thereby you have a gap in between the state of the art and the defined clinical safety and performance objectives and what you actually want to achieve with your clinical investigation. What data do you want to collect? And even sometimes we see that the CDP does not reflect clearly then the actually clinical investigation in the end. And last but not least, the lifetime of the product and the data does not always match up. So I will try to come back to these common findings throughout the presentation and make sure that I highlight how to actually come around this during the process of setting the stage for your clinical safety and performance endpoints. Let's see if I can change slides. Oh, I did too much here. Sorry about that. Here we go. So when we walk through the different definitions of relevance for this topic, we need to talk about performance, clinical performance, and clinical benefits. In accordance with the MDR and relevant MDCG guidelines, the performance of a device is stated as the device ability to achieve its intended purpose as stated by the manufacturer. And extending that into the clinical performance, it's the medical device ability to achieve its intended purpose and thereby leading to a clinical benefit when it's used as intended. And the clinical benefit means the positive impact of a device on the health of an individual. And it's expressed in, this is very important, a meaningful and measurable and also patient relevant clinical outcome. And that includes outcome related to the diagnosis or positive impact on patient management or public health. So these are the key three cornerstones in how to define your clinical endpoint in the end. If you do not have clear statements around this, you get there is a risk of kind of lose track along the way. Remember, defining these parameters is done normally very early stage, and your clinical investigation is maybe a couple of years out in the future. So it's very important to have this clearly defined in your technical documentation and that the whole organization is aligned with it. And in line with this, we can also walk through one of the other MDR requirements, which is the about the claims. Article 7 describes that the technical documentation that face the almost at the audience, but the subjects and the users and the third parties must not be misleading regarding the device's intended purpose, safety, and performance. And this should be understood in a way that all the claims or statement that's made about the product's intended purpose, safety, and performance shall be based on actually factual evidence and data. And this is where you have to, as a regulator, work very closely with your marketing and sales department very early stage, and we will come back to that, to be sure that you have identified their wishes from the market into the previous statements that we talked about. So what is the link between the clinical benefit and the clinical claims? There is a general confusion about the definitions of clinical claims and clinical benefits, where clinical claims are often understood as a marketing statement, as we mentioned before, and clinical benefits as benefit identified in the clinical investigations performed. It's described in the MDCG 2019-9 that the two terms are linked together, and in the client Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance, what we also call the SSCP, we have a description of the documented clinical benefits for patients with relevant and specified clinical outcome measures and the success rate for achieving the outcome measured included. So this should be described for all clinical claims the manufacturer are presenting in the instruction for use and in any information, marketing, or promotional material that is distributed. And I think it's important here to notice that the measures and the success and the actual success rates needs to be clearly defined, and this comes from the statements that we mentioned earlier in the presentation, that you have a clear understanding of that. When we look into the other processes that are running in a circular matter with the manufacturer, we can mention also the risk management process, the ISO 14971 2019. We are used to working with this standard to define, identify, and analyze and assess the risk that we have identified or we think that the device has, and that we evaluate along the way. This standard also look into the benefits, and it defines the benefits of having a positive impact of desired outcomes of the use of a medical device on the health of an individual, or positive impact on patient management or public health. And this is one of the because we are so used to working with the risk management, it is often not considered as part of this process to actually also work with the benefits or the clinical claims that we would like to have available later on for our products. And it can include the positive impact on the clinical outcome and also the patient's quality of life, outcome related to diagnosis, and also impact on the diagnostic devices and clinical outcomes, and impact on public health. But we will come back to the ISO standard for risk management later on when we talk more about the precise example. But if we move on to where we actually need to work with the defined benefit and also the risks, is the benefit risk assessment. And the benefit risk assessment is the analysis of all the benefits and risks that you have identified during this analysis of how your product is used. And it's used according to the intended purpose. And the benefit risk assessment is also described very clearly in both the MDR in a lot of places, and also in the ISO standard for risk management, and in the clinical ISO 14155. It is also a process and assessment that is mentioned in several of the MDCG guidelines, where we touch upon the clinical and the regulatory area, because the benefit risk assessment is what actually concludes on if you considering that the product is safe and performing, can be used on subjects before clinical investigation or before market release. And the benefit risk assessment is an integrated part of the key processes in the MDR. So that's the whole design and development process. You can have a risk that you cannot mitigate further, but because the device has several benefits that are outweighing the risk, you can actually release the product for clinical use. It's also part of the technical documentation It's a central part of the clinical evaluation and the investigational process and reporting. And I do not know any of the authorities or ethics committee who do not want a solid benefit risk assessment before they allow you to use your device on patient during clinical investigation. And then last but not least, it's also a part of the conclusion when you do your later post-market surveillance analysis. So how do we determine our safety claims? The safety claims. In Europe under the MDR, the primary goal during the development of a medical device is the collection of data demonstrating safety and performance, whereas under the US CFR, the aim is for demonstrating safety and efficacy. And the efficacy data are in Europe also of relevance for demonstrating an economic benefit after market approval. So safety claims are most often the easiest to identify compared to performance claims, which can be a little more tricky, and I'll come back to that. And safety claims are identified, or safety objectives, identified through, for example, the vigilance databases that we have available, so the MODE database and the TPLC under the FDR, from the literature or our own preclinical and clinical investigations. And the risk are assessed through the risk assessment according to the standard that we just mentioned before, the ISO 14971. And remember to use the most recent version. We often see that the old version is used when we see the risk assessment. The risk to both the subject users and third parties are to be considered. This is also one of the findings that we often see, that the two last, the users and the third parties, are not included. And in the risk management process, often these risks that are above a certain level is included in the later benefit risk assessment, and you control that through your risk management process and your risk review meetings. The assessment to determine the method or how to assess the safety is what is mostly challenging in my experience. And this is where the communication with the authorities are normally very helpful to guide us such that the most relevant method, or the method that the authorities would like to see used for determining a safety outcome, is also used. We have had several cases where we have suggested a regular collection of safety during a clinical investigation, but that the authorities asked for an additional method to be used to assess for safety events. So this is very important and can be where you can stumble during the clinical investigation if this is not conducted in according to the regulators' expectations. If we look at the clinical outcome data, typical examples of outcome data are cure or clinical worsening or mortality. And the primary outcome is the parameter that is the most of relevant to answer during, for instance, as a research question. And ideally, it should be patient-centered, so it should be of matter to the patient, such as quality of life or survival. So how do we actually assess the clinical outcome? Well, these outcomes are assessed using patient-related outcome instruments such as questionnaires or scales or diaries. And the data are the output reports that are evaluated by trained healthcare professionals regarding the interpretations of the signs and behaviors that are the output and can be reserved related to the patient's disease and condition. So, for example, a clinical endpoint of clinical trial studying a new therapy may be the reducing the number of hospitalization for respiratory distress. And in this case, the clinical outcome is hospitalizations for respiratory distress. So now the last point, which is a little complex in my mind, it is considered by some quite straightforward, but I think that there are many details in defining the right performance criteria or the performance data to identify these that supports the intended use. So the intended use is defined by the MDR, and it means the use for which a device is intended according to the data supplied by the manufacturer on the label, and then the instructions for use or in the promotional sales material or any other statements that are specified by the manufacturer in the clinical evaluation. And the intended use is often a short statement that includes a general description of the device, including both the intended purpose and the intended users, the intended patient population and medical conditions to be diagnosed, treated, and monitored, and other considerations, and then principles of operation of the device and the mode of action is normally also included with a which is scientifically demonstrated if necessary. So the goal here is to define the data that needs to be generated from a performance perspective, to show that the product, when it's used according to the intended use, is both safe and also performs. So what is it that the device actually do towards the patient? And this is just quite problematic for many manufacturers. And you have to consider also when you need to do a test, more or less, that when you have tried with a couple of intended users and defined your performance criteria, I made some examples here. It could be temperature measurement or ease of use or accuracy of placement. When you move forward and you start building up your device description, which seems like a very simple document, it contains normally a device description, intended indication, users, and so on. But when you walk through this very detailed description of the device, you can sometimes see that both the intended use and also the performance data that you will need, you made it very complex for yourself, or the methods are not available, and maybe there is not a precedence for doing in this way. And again, this is one of the places where it would be good to ask for some guidance. I know you will not get approval from the authorities, but ask, for instance, the FDA about how to, through your clinical investigation, supported by your preclinical data, what performance data are you going to collect, and with what methods. So when you have gone so far, now we have all the link between the essential requirements under the MDR and also the FDA about performance, clinical performance, and clinical benefit. So I'm a big fan of tables. Make it very simple to keep an overview, and use make the statements based on your data that you would like to collect around safety and performance, and how your clinical performance will be originate from your performance criteria, and what statements can you do about your clinical benefits, and what supported claims can you do. When you have this in a table format, you will always be able to go back to this table and then use it in other of the technical documents that you will need to build up. For instance, your clinical evaluation plan, clinical evaluation report, the whole PMS, as we talked about, and the PMCF plan and report. So a very important tool to have next to you all the time, to keep track on the data points that you are trying to collect, so you don't get lost. So if we look at then the overview of the process, how we would work with it, we have the device description and the intended purpose described. And through these documents, we start to define the clinical benefit and also the intended purpose and the safety requirements. We also work on in parallel, the outcome parameters based on these statements. And again, they are based on the state of the art, the literature that you have available, including your own clinical and preclinical data. In these, in the state of the art, remember also to include your PMS vigilance data from similar products or own products. So when you have these statements prepared around safety and performance and clinical benefits, you can start the mapping of the actually endpoints. How are you going to measure these how are you going to collect the data in your clinical investigations? So simply link them one by one to your clinical investigations. And I say investigations because you might need to set up several investigations to be able to fulfill the gap towards your safety and performance statements. When you have that overview, you would also have an overview of the data that would come in eventually. And when you have the data, you might actually need to go backwards again, go in circle, and then restart, because the data didn't come out as you actually expected it to come. So this is the overall process chart that we use normally. Oops. So what are the best practices for defining the outcome parameters? And one way to work out this would be to involve a lot of different stakeholders. Could be subject matter experts and clinicians and patients. These parameters are linked to the safety and performance and clinical outcome. It's not something that you can do as a one-man group. So engage a multidisciplinary team and ensure that you have input and consideration with various perspectives, and in defining the outcome parameters and how to measure these. So this is where, at least from my part, I'm not a physician, clinician. I have an idea about the data because that I would like to collect, because I found that in the literature, in our own data. But I need to talk to the clinicians or the patient subject matter experts to tell me, is this actually practically possible, and is it of relevance to the end user? It could also be that you would have to conduct pilot studies and refine the outcome parameters. It could be pilot studies allowing iterations of refinements of both the outcome parameters, but also maybe on the device and device setting on the early stage. And you could identify potential issues and optimize on how you're going to measure the actually a methodology you're going to use. And then again, incorporate feedback from the regulatory agencies, talk with we have the opportunity with the FDA to seek feedback from the FDA on the outcome parameters, how we have defined them, and the process that we would like to use, the methods. And I know also in Europe that it's one of the things being talked about at the latest RAPS meeting is that we might see the same opportunities in Europe. It's only something that I heard being talked about, but it's really valuable information that you can receive through interaction with the FDA. And just to highlight that there are several stakeholders also within your own company. We spoke about earlier in the presentation about, the marketing claim. What are the sales and marketing people? What is it that they would like to go out and sell? What are the obstacles that they meet? What are the safety and performance and outcome parameters that they would like to use? It could also be the people sitting with the clinical evaluations in your company, the risk management engineers. So make sure that this process around defining what is it actually around this unique new product that we would like to state on a later stage when it is released for the market. So many stakeholders to interact with. So when you now interact with the different stakeholders, how are you going to get a good discussion going. So we have actually I've been working on this together with one of my colleagues, not internally but externally, David Rutledge, how he has set the stage for actually work on defining the benefits. And he used these 12 sentences to identify if there are any issues that could apply, or not issues, where there are situations where this specific product used for the specific indication and intended use, that there are benefits that should be addressed. So it can be the patient perspective through quality of life. Are there any benefits expected there? Through the healthcare professionals and caregivers, is there a medical necessity? Different types of benefits, also that it can be also the magnitude of the benefits, of time and scale, the likelihood or probability. How likely is it that this will happen? Is there a reduction in the probability of death? Is there an aid in improvement in the patient function, such as an organ system? And is it is it a likelihood that it's reducing the probability of loss of a function or relief of symptoms? Is it duration of the benefit? Or is it benefit when compared to alternative therapy or state of the art? So while walking through these different questions, and they can be aligned towards your own product and your own company and the whole medical arena that you are working with. This is just, and it's linked to one of the examples that I have in the end. If we have time, I will walk through that. But this is how David, he used these questions to identify relevant benefits. Here we go. So now when you have gone through these different questions, you set the stage for good discussion internally. You identify the benefits, the size and the likelihood and the duration of the effect, and then also look at the different stakeholders, the patient, the users, and the third parties view on this, and also again the medical necessity of the benefit. When we have documented this, we would be able to work with this in a more structured manner and build up specific tables where we start adding references. What data do we actually have available for these specific benefits? And again, I will show it in an example in the end of the presentation, but it's really, as we saw earlier, this needs to be measurable, and then there needs to be some numbers on. So we have the different benefit statements. We need to go and look for the available data that we have at the present stage. The same is the process for the risk. Again, standard questions that we will go through to identify risk from that are applicable for the different stakeholders that you are discussing with. You can use these as examples. They're more or less turned around compared to the benefit assessment. And based on this, we will end up with specific, again, this is a process that we are very much used to working with the risk. The types of the harms and the risk will be identified, the magnitude and the severity, the likelihood, the duration, and the patient, the third parties, and users' perspective, and also false positive and false negative results. Again, this is made from a process that has been adapted to really high-risk class products and needs to be adapted. But when you walk through the different questions, you will normally end up with similar framework for your discussion internally, and it will help you set up a product which is safe in the end, and that you are able to both conduct your benefit risk assessment that we'll walk into shortly, but also make sure that you have identified the measures that you would have to do for the actually medical device, and the device and or manufacturing process controls, and also the information that you will have to provide to the users on the labeling and the IFU. The uncertainties in the potential risk is something that we see that there is a lack of understanding sometimes in the way that this needs to be presented towards the users. So we see often findings when we have conducted the assessment of the risk and the benefit, that there are not the complete product portfolio. There might not be, it might not be the actual procedure. Does the state of the art describes the procedure that it will be used for, or is the risk and benefit analyzed from a more simple aspect? And there are several other points where it can give some uncertainties in the actually benefit risk assessment. And we will have to remember that we will need to state in, for instance, the instruction for use, any residual risk. And if we don't have residual risk mentioned because our analysis for some reason have been a little too simplified both on the benefit and the risk side, we might see this risk when we then face the reality during our clinical investigation, and we will then have to go back and redo our assessments and our documentation, and this is both very time consuming and also something which costs a lot of money in delays. So jumping to, I'll skip this one. I missed one slide, sorry about that. You will have all the slides afterwards and the presentations. I'm actually not sure they're sharing the slides, sorry about that. We will find out. So the benefit risk assessment. So we have an analysis at the end here, just as I mentioned, where we measure or we analyze the benefit up against the risk, and both in a matter where we have some numbers on the size of the benefits towards the patient, probability, and also the duration compared to severity, number of rate of harm, probability of the event, and duration of the harmful event. And when you do that detailed analysis, you will end up with the outcome that you will present towards the authorities during the, for instance, a clinical investigation. And that is again linked towards the safety and performance objectives, because this is the data that you would like to have included in your endpoint to clarify, at least for the risks that you foresee that you are able to collect data towards. There are some risks that you are not able to remove because it just belongs to that type of product. So we mentioned it before that the benefit risk assessment is an integral part of the technical documentation throughout the process of the development of the device. Of course, also in the risk management, where this analysis is a very important part. The clinical evaluation, here again, both the benefit and the risk is more or less what is centralizing your evaluation of the clinical use of the product. And therefore, the more clear, remember we had the table up front where we showed the parameters for safety, performance, and clinical outcome that we would like to demonstrate. And then we went through a process to try and identify the endpoints that will show us these statements, and also the methods that we would like to use. And the analysis, if all this, when it comes together, will show us if the device is safe and performs. Is one place is the clinical evaluation, where you also include the benefit risk assessment. This is where you conclude that you are able to continue with your either clinical investigation or your market release of the product. So again, I'm a big fan of tables, and I'm really a big fan of trying to map out to be sure that I have all the claims mapped out. I have defined my my safety and performance and clinical outcome parameters. I have defined my claims. Now I need to find out in which documents, because there could be different levels of documents where the different claims could be could collect data to support that, and make sure that when you move on to the clinical study. So I always work with this table formats where I list out the different claims and make sure that there is a red thread between the actually intended use, indication for use, all the way to the claim, and where in the documentation that I can find the data to support my claims. So how to address the clinical benefit in investigation? Yeah, you have to make sure that your investigation is, first of all, designed, and also is authorized and conducted, recorded and reported as part of a clinical evaluation for conformity assessment purpose. So it is very important that your the actually clinical investigation is seen as an integral part of your technical documentation. I think that's what I'm trying to say. I see sometimes that the clinical investigations are set up more to support, and of course it should also do that, a clinical need, but the link from a regulatory perspective into the technical documentation is lacking. There is not this red thread between what's actually done in the investigation and what is needed from a technical documentation perspective. The investigation needs to confirm that you actually have the anticipated benefits, that the data shows that this is fulfilled, and that you have seen that there are the risks that you have identified upfront is also what you see during the investigation. If you see new things, there are measures to take, and also established procedure on how to work with this. The sponsor also ensure that the subject should be informed about the risk. We talked about the instructions for use. Normally the patient doesn't see that, but in the patient information, similar information about the objectives, benefits, and implication and risk and inconvenience are described. And that's all linked back to all the documentation that we just spoke about. It includes including subjects other than, if we are including other subjects than adults, we also need to make sure that this is justified and described in a good, layman's term towards the group of patients that the product is intended for. In the post-market surveillance, PMS data are also where we need the benefit risk assessment, and we continuously update both with the literature and the data from our clinical investigation and other investigation. It can be something completely different that you are developing in the company, and that gives input to the risk assessment for another product. Then find the gaps. This is what the last slides that I have. I'm really sorry I talk a lot, but I think it's important to understand that this is a process that are continuously developing. So even though that you upfront have been very clear stating your safety and performance and clinical objectives, you have to be able to demonstrate all the way along the way of the development of the device that you have the supporting data and the evidence at the quality needed to support your intended use and your indication for use. And these are just two examples which are linked to some of the previous slides that I showed. Put it down in writing so there are no misunderstanding, and this is shared with the team to be sure that nothing is missed along the way. So we'll not start initiating a clinical study, and then at the end of the day you don't have the data that you will need. Again, it's also important to know that there are different methods to collect these data under a clinical investigation method. So there is everything from really regulatory studies until product and clinical surveys. So when you look at the different classes of devices, the different classes will require different levels of evidence. And this is where you can go in and play around with where do I collect the actual data to support my intended use, safety and performance objectives for this specific product. So again, make the table, make the overview. And again, if you have several products, maybe some of the data to support some claims can come from other investigations that so you have the full picture and have full advantage of the money you are investing in the clinical studies. And now just the final slide, I think it is. Yes, I'm running out of time, so I'll skip the example. I'm sorry about that. But the regulatory pathway is often seen as a one-way street. But this diagram is from this figure is from the FDA, one of the FDA white papers. And as you see, this is a circular process. And again, remember to keep up to date the statements around intended use and how to define your safety and performance objective, and be willing to go back and readjust these. Also, if there are coming new information from outside, something happens with similar devices, you should be able to come back to these statements and adjust these so that they fit with the real world and not stick to old statements that will maybe result in that you do not end up with the data that you actually need in the end. So this was, as I say, I will skip the slide because I've talked for 50 minutes almost. And I will just here at the end open up for questions. And I would also like to thank, I've used some time together with my good friend Nette from company Rescue about the practical implications on how to work with safety and performance objectives. Stephanie and Søren from my own team, and then David Rutledge, who is an expert in benefit risk assessment. So I leave it up to you, Etienne, to take it from here.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much. There was a question. I'll just answer this one right now because I know you mentioned it as well. Will the slides be shared? Yes, we will be sharing the slides later as well. So, so keep an eye out for a follow-up email for that, and you should be able to get those. All right, so let's look at the questions. Daniel Beltran asked, when you have multiple clinical performance claims, how do you choose the main one in order to define a primary endpoint in a clinical investigation?
Well, there are several considerations to make here, right? It's both the stage you are at with the development of the device, the state of the art for similar devices, and because the primary endpoint, performance endpoint, will normally determine the size of the clinical study. So there might be some strategic work to consider here, but you always have to, at the end of the day, what you would like to state around your product that it can actually do, that is your performance claim, not something that you design to support a specific statistical purpose. You need to be very sure and talk with your team on what is it actually that we would like to sell our products for. What can it do?
Okay. Great. Adrian asked the question, is there a big difference in the amount of clinical data that needs to be submitted for Class 2A versus 2B devices? Can you speak to the differences there?
Yeah. No, there is. You can, I see for Class 1 devices, non-sterile clinical studies with more than 200 patients. It comes down to what you would like to state for your product. So if your performance criteria, when you analyze this statistically, you will have to follow that number. So there is no difference. I have class 3 products where we ended up with 20 patients, just to have something to compare with.
Okay, great. Kinoja, I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly. Is ease of use, accuracy of placement not more relevant for usability than performance? This was kind of a discussion in the chat, so I don't know if you want to weigh in on this one as well. It looked like there was a lot of good discussion.
Mm-hmm. It is both for usability and for clinical, and this is one of my favorite topics. I'm a big fan of you need to look at the data pool, and you still have to see the usability setting, as this is not real life. So if you have any concerns and identified some risk or even some benefits that you would like to highlight, that only can be demonstrated in a clinical setting outside of the usability lab, then you will move it to a clinical investigation.
Okay.
Or do both.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, Doug asked the question, how can you show a clinical outcome if the product does not come into contact with the patient? In our case, the product is an autoclave that is used to sterilize medical devices, but...
Yeah, we have what we call, I need to remember that, indirect benefits. And this could be one example where this could come into play. So your autoclave will make sure that devices are clean, and therefore patients will not die due to an infection. That's, as I understand, an indirect benefit.
Okay, cool. Can you make an example of devices that do not require clinical data? For example, MDR 6110.
Yes, we have done clinical evaluations according to 6110 for monitors. So that were going to be, screens that had included specific software, but were not in touch with the patient. It did not have a medical purpose in itself.
Okay. And I'm trying to kind of keep eye on the chat as well, but those of you listening, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. I'll make sure that I get those asked. And if we don't get to your questions as well, we can forward those on to Helene, and she can, if she's able to answer them, sure she gets to them as she's able. Okay, great. Next question is from Kidkar. What are the implications of protocol design in medical devices? What criteria for study design? I know you kind of covered this a little bit, but I don't know if you want to touch on this again.
Yeah. There are several designs. If you look into the ISO 14155, I really like the table, which is in one of the annexes, and I can never remember the number. So you will have to look that up yourself. But there are, now we have defined under the ISO 14155, different setup of specific designs for medical device studies, and really early stage, what are the implications or the requirement for these, and the later stage, and also the post-market studies. So I really refer to that table in the ISO standard, and then work the design according to that. Medical device investigations are normally more simple in design than pharmaceutical investigations.
Okay, very cool. I have one. Let's make it maybe this the last question. We just kind of look through. I think this would be a good last question. I know you've been talking for a while here. So Nicholas asked, do you have any recommendations on a robust methodology to score quantitatively the benefits for further benefit risk ratio analysis? There was some discussion about actually quantifying benefits. So yeah.
I would look into the literature, and I would make, for instance, consult with physicians for non-documented benefits. And I would also do, if there is a benefit where I'm not really sure about quantitatively where to put it, I would maybe do a pilot.